Hello and welcome back to the Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow, where we are talking all things HBO's The Gilded Age. I am Kelsie Paul. I'm the Interim Director of Learning and Visitor Experience at the Frick Pittsburgh. Today, I am joined by two of my wonderful colleagues. We have the Frick's Executive Director, Amanda Gillen, and we have our Learning and Interpretive Coordinator, Dalena Collins. We're going to jump right in because we have no time to waste. There's so many things to talk about. Today, we are talking about Season 3, Episode 3, Love is Never Easy. The synopsis is, while George enters tense negotiations, Larry and Jack meet with a potential investor, and later the Scotts meet the Kirklands. We're going to talk about all three of those things today in great detail. One of the things that we were talking about is there's an interesting kind of thematic through line in this episode, if you're able to spot it. This idea that, there's a premium put on image, like image or perception is everything. And Dalena, I know that was something that you noticed really early on as you were watching the episode. Specifically, there are some consequences to putting image over everything. What did you notice as you were watching?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest notes I made is it just feels like image and the way that these families are perceived basically shape their entire lives. And I think that this is something that we can apply to the show in general. But in this specific episode, I felt as though there are some consequences that they don't always face when they're looking at this image. I think especially with Gladys and Bertha and that relationship, and even with Jack and the clock, I think that there are a lot of times that people are realizing in this episode that this kind of prioritization of how people view you can really affect your personal relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it was a really interesting dynamic.
Well, and it's that gilding, right? Like we talk a lot about that at the Frick, within the context of our tour of our historic house of Clayton, which like the term, the Gilded Age, like it's named that for a reason. Like this idea that there's this thin facade of glittery gold, wonderful things. But if you just chip away at that like a little bit, there is a sort of more complicated truth underneath. And so much of this era and this society is like gilding their reputations, gilding their sort of front-facing, facade to the public. And I think, a lot of this episode was getting to the uglier truths underneath. So let's dive in.
It's just the first layer. Like there are so many other ones.
You don't have to dig that far.
Yeah.
Let's get to Gladys and the Duke though, because we see the sort of culmination of everything. I don't know about you. I was a little disappointed we didn't get to see any of the dinner. I wanted to see just like a little bit of that awkward dinner. But instead we jump right in to everyone else sitting in the drawing room, tensely waiting as George negotiates with the Duke and his lawyer in his office. And just as we suspected last week, George is basically negotiating a marriage contract. The Duke wants more and more money. He is not particularly happy with the initial offer that George puts on the table, which George finds to be absolutely insane. So we don't know what the actual the amount is, but it's something crazy. And he basically keeps saying, the money that George has offered is not going to be enough to sustain what he is looking to sustain in terms of his family home and all of these things. So, Amanda, remind us a little bit about what's going on generally with the European aristocracy at this point. Why is somebody like the Duke so desperate for such a high influx of cash?
Yeah, it's an interestingly timed scenario in the late 19th century, mid to late, where the United States is on the rise, industrially, sort of commercially, population, everything is going up. And Europe is in many ways struggling. In England in particular, there are a lot of factors coming into play that were affecting the nobility in particular, right? The landowners. This is very much the Downton Abbey story, where you have, if our viewers have watched Downton, which I'm sure many of you have, you have the home, you have the land. These these families are very land and property rich, but not necessarily cash rich. So you could be land rich and cash poor. A lot of changes were happening in the agricultural, downturns, different things with farming the land. And then these homes had been built, hundreds of years prior. The cost of maintaining these stately homes, these manor homes that, that people like the Duke, as much as we dislike him, he is responsible for. And, he is trying to find a way to sort of keep his family property together. But in the Victorian era Gilded Age in America, you start to see the literal breakdown of a lot of these homes where plots of land are being sold, property that's been in a family for generations is being carved up. Works of art are being sold, ways to raise cash. And another way that they stumble on is to find the young American heiresses to marry. I mean, history is full of these stories of young American women being, married over. So beneficial because the Americans are looking for status and to sort of link up with the nobility, and the British aristocracy needs that support. So this is one example of many, many.
Mm-hmm. And, obviously we've talked to death about the fact that the storyline is very much based on Consuelo Vanderbilt, but, we see exactly what Dawn was talking about last week, this contract situation where George is very much following the kind of game plan of William K. Vanderbilt, where his best and final offer is essentially, I'm going to give you X amount of money, but I'm also going to set up Gladys with her own yearly income, essentially, and it's going to be hers, which is a little unprecedented, I think, within sort of these traditional marriage contracts, this idea that this would be truly her money. And that is initially the deal breaker for the Duke. He sort of has a little fit, like the man-child that he is, and sort of stands up, and his lawyer is trying to get him to chill out, and he won't do it. And so, he goes in and sort of announces to Bertha that it's all off and he's leaving. And Bertha, I think, is really thrown for a loop. I truly don't think she believed that this was not going to go in her favor. And she's a little caught off guard. But Dalena, you mentioned that in this episode, we get to see her go full Bertha. She is at her best in this episode.
Yeah. I think none of us are surprised that Bertha is intense, right? We've seen this intensity in the past. But seeing her truly go toe to toe with George, I don't know if we've really seen them vehemently disagree on something before. And she is just so firm in her belief, almost to the point where she kind of sets herself up for failure and then realizes very quickly that she's going to have to make this happen regardless of literally anything else, even her familial relationships. And she does it. So I mean, hats off to her. A little intense, maybe, but she's got to do what she's got to do.
Bertha Russell can backdoor deal with the best of them.
Yes.
The fact that she sees the Delancey connection, she gets him in there. It's very interesting. And I think, again, we see her time, we've seen it throughout the season, her and George sort of going toe to toe over this idea that Gladys should or should not be able to marry for love. And George seems at first very, committed to making that happen for Gladys, but we see Bertha wear him down a little bit as time goes on. And there's that interesting conversation where she, he says well, we married for love and we're cool, we're good, we've been happy. And she kind of says, well, yeah, we married for love, but we also were well suited for each other. And she says that that's really where their marital success has come from. And she claims that she thinks that Gladys and the Duke are well suited. I don't know how she's determined that, because I think they've interacted for exactly 5 minutes at any given point in the show. But Dalena, you were saying that statistically there may be something to what Bertha is claiming about marriage success and arrangement versus love matches.
Yeah. Arranged marriages have a divorce rate, of anywhere from 4 to 6%, which is very, very low. Now I'd like to preface this statement by saying consensual arranged marriages are probably the vibe that we would be talking about. But there's definitely something to be said about having a relationship that you are meant to or expected to work at, instead of some love matches where people might expect marriage to be really easy. And it's not all the time. And so I think that obviously Gladys should be able to choose her future and choose if that's what she wants to do. But I don't think that marrying the Duke would be the end of the world, and it could prove to be, a decent life for Gladys.
Yeah, and we'll talk about her and the Duke specifically in a second, but I do want to swing back to George because he seems very gung-ho about kind of putting roadblocks in place so that this doesn't happen until kind of the end. And I think, Amanda, you might have pointed out, like, it almost becomes like a competition for him. Like you start to see that competitive nature, that ambition, that ruthlessness comes out, where it becomes suddenly much less about Gladys's happiness and more about getting the upper hand in the deal. And once it really does become a negotiation, like, Amanda, like, how do you see that sort of play out with like that way that ruthlessness is kind of seems to be built into these guys' personalities and like why they are so successful?
Yeah, that's how I saw it. There was sort of a moment or a point in this where George he had been vacillating between sort of father slash head of the household, businessman, kind of all of that, and going into this, telling Gladys like I'll put a stop to this, and obviously this financial thing that he offered was his attempt. But then he's sort of like affronted by the Duke saying, no, thank you. And that's where something, at least I saw, shifted, and he goes into businessman mode, right? Like, I'm going to win this. You are a fool. Yeah. I think he kind of says, this is a very good deal. What are you doing? And it's like he toughens up, and sort of his daughter isn't mentioned again. It becomes nothing about her. And you see a negotiator, you see a man who's used to getting his way, almost to the point of like losing sight of the end of it. The end of it is what he didn't really want to happen, which is that his daughter will be gone and married off. But he sort of in my mind, set that aside and was like, no, I'm going to get this. And then seemed very pleased and fine with it all in the end, like a proud negotiator, like I got this done, and I think some of that maybe had to do with Bertha, but it was also just instincts kicking in, people like George Russell, like Henry Clay Frick, like, other industrialists were used to getting their way, to making a deal happen. If you think about all these other scenes with George, where he's like, get it done. This is how it's going to be, right? He is used to controlling the board, and the Duke put up a little bit of a roadblock. I think that like caught him up in it for a few minutes.
Yeah, right. He can't be bested. Of course, not the same as Mr. Delancey, because Mr. Delancey very clearly says, my daughter's going to choose who she wants to marry. I don't want my grandchildren growing up across the sea where I never see them. Like a very different point of view, to which Bertha's just sort of like, what are you talking about? Like, who cares? Like, she's
okay.
Yeah, she's like, okay, like, that's fine.
Good for you.
I do really quickly want to talk about it, though, because what was the vibe?
Yeah.
With Delancey and Bertha? Like,
yeah.
there's a very odd moment at the end where he's like, you're so much more interesting than the Duke, and she kind of like, and I'm like, what is happening? Like, what are we doing? What do you think is going on there? I'm desperate to know.
Breakdown.
Yeah, no, I definitely caught it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, they're clearly flirting, or at least he's flirting with her. She definitely doesn't put a stop to it. She gives like a little smirk.
Yeah.
And then he just disappears again into the night. So yeah. I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
That's bold and somewhat inappropriate, but their whole interaction was like 3 minutes long, and at the end he's like, I kind of love you, it was just very, very surprising. I don't think she was at all taken with him. I think it was flattery, and she's just getting her way, she'll do what she has to. But it was funny how, because it was what she did wasn't typical or right, hauling him in under false pretenses and basically, trying to strong arm him. But clearly he thought she was something.
Yeah. I don't know. It's like the only thing I could think of is that like he recognizes her for her cunning and her willingness to kind of do whatever it takes in a way that I think George doesn't appreciate her for as much. Like sometimes he does, like he gives her credit for, doing things that she wants to do. But I think oftentimes George sees Bertha as like more of a roadblock to his own sort of interests than anything else. So it did make me think that like maybe she appreciated like a guy being like, yeah, I see what you're doing here and I'm impressed. Like you are an impressive lady.
He almost
Because
gets like exasperated with her,
yeah.
like, and feeling like he really looks down on her world and the society being, he's like, he literally says at the beginning of the episode, I don't care about this. This is your thing.
Yeah, George. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it is, of course, we'll see what happens going forward. We have this moment towards the end where we finally get like a little bit of interaction between the Duke and Gladys, which like one of the things that has annoyed me the most about this whole storyline is that the Duke really has seemed totally fine with just kind of dealing with Bertha, and Gladys has almost been like a non-entity to him. And it's like, bro, like propose, like do
Say hi.
like look in her direction, perhaps, like before you agree to marry this child, essentially.
Although she looks terrified every time he does, so maybe he can't bear it,
He does. She's like a deer in the headlights every time he's in the room. But we get this really interesting scene between the two of them where like they end up having kind of an honest and frank conversation about their situation, which I think is really interesting. And they both kind of acknowledge that this is really weird. And Gladys flat out is like, are you a little ashamed of the fact that you are just truly marrying me for my money? And he's just kind of like, no. Not really. He's like, nope, I'm doing what I have to do. But to what you were saying earlier, like, I think we get to see a little bit of what their marriage potentially could be. I liked that they kind of came to this space of, hey, like, let's just promise, if nothing else, to be honest with each other. Like, we're not going to lie to each other. So you see ways in which like, maybe there's something there like that could grow. But at the end of the day, it's like they do not know each other. And I feel like I hope that it's not going to turn into a situation where he's like a raging alcoholic or, something like that. Like, and that it turns out that he's not at all what Bertha thought he was. But we will see. She definitely looks like a woman being led to the gallows at the end. She's like clutching her pearls and then
literally clutching her pearls.
I was like, oh, who has to pick up all those pearls?
Yeah.
Well, I thought about Bertha. I was like, oh, she's going to kill her later for that very unsophisticated moment of, a real, but she'd been fiddling with those. We all noticed, a lot of the time leading up to that scene. And what did you say, Dalena? It's like the end of innocence, the end of her youth. I mean, it could symbolize a whole bunch of things around, her life changing and she has no control over it. So,
I think it's a realization that like, this is happening. Like, this is no longer just a possibility or a thing that my dad is going to get me out of. Like, this is happening. She's agreed to it and it's going to go forward, whether she likes it or not. And as Bertha says, she intends for this to be the wedding of the century. So love a wedding episode of a television
It's going to be fun. Did you see, though, we didn't talk about this, but if you look at her face in the Sargent portrait, she's fearful. I mean, he captures her eyes because as he's painting, all this is playing out and you see it. They didn't show it long, but she's not a confident, happy woman in that portrait at all.
Yeah, I made note of that as well. She looks like really scared. And then he gives this whole speech about how it represents her future, which is like probably not a happy thing for her to hear.
No, bad foreshadowing for Gladys for sure. And we also do, kind of running along this storyline, we do have this interesting moment between Marian and Larry. We gotta talk about it. They are just racking up the steamy kisses left and right, like just episode after episode. But we talked last week about all of the etiquette and the rules around courtship and all of those things. And as soon as Larry started to shut that door, I was like, no, sir, do not be shutting that door to that drawing room. Like, you are not supposed to be doing that. And of course, we see the lady's maid, walk in and catch them. And I think it's so interesting the way Larry kind of like almost laughs it off. Not laughs it off, but he just sort of is like, it's fine. Like, it's not a big deal. And I love, love, love the scene after that, when Marian goes and talks to Ada and is like freaking out about what is happening and what has happened, and is rightfully really, really concerned about what this is going to mean and all of these things. And Ada has this really sort of wise observation, which is just, pointing out that double standard that we have talked about, which is that Larry doesn't have to worry about it, really. Like, Larry's already had an affair with an older woman and like done whatever he's been out doing. But like, the standards for Larry are not the same for Marian. And so it's like, if you look at the scoreboard, it's like, she's got 2 quasi failed engagements, and she can't be getting caught canoodling with single men in their mother's drawing room. And of course, the lady's maid immediately turns around and tells Bertha. Like,
Yeah.
I want to get your thoughts, because I couldn't tell if she kind of plays it like she didn't mean to say it, or she thought Bertha already knew. But I'm interested to hear, like, do you think that was intentional on her part, or like to stir the pot a little bit? Or was she sort of like, hey, I saw this, you're my boss, I'm telling you? But I don't know. It was a really interesting way that she went about it, I thought.
I thought maybe she did it to try and get some gossip or some scoop. But then, because she seemed to pull back when Bertha was like, what do you mean? What did you see? The lady's maid got a little alarmed, almost like, nothing. It was nothing, I'm sure. She sort of walked it back a little bit. Maybe she was hoping to be a little conspiratorial and get some gossip, and it backfired almost a little bit. She probably doesn't imagine there'd be something Bertha doesn't know about, in her household. So I don't know that it was meant to be nefarious. I think she was maybe gossiping, and then it turned into something that, she surprised her and surprised Bertha at the same time.
Yeah, I was surprised at how surprised Bertha was, because she's a smart lady. Like, I don't know why she wouldn't expect for them to be canoodling.
I don't think she's paying attention. I don't think she's paying a bit of attention to Larry or Marian. I think Gladys has been in that portrait, and this, that's why I wonder if she's going to shift her focus, or if Gladys is going to continue to be the, the sole winner or loser, or I guess, of her mother's attention. But I don't think she's been paying any attention to what Larry is up to.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say. And I think, it will be interesting, because you see where she clocks it. Like, she's distracted because, like, right after that, George, sends the note saying that he's not going to accompany her to the opera, and she's mad and all that stuff. But you see that moment of recognition where she clocks it, and maybe it does connect, because it's like, oh yeah, he did invite her to this like very specific family dinner. Like, maybe she is starting to notice, like, oh yeah, Marian has been kind of around, but it's not clear yet, what her reaction to that would be. I mean, Marian herself says, like, any man who's going to marry me is going to marry me because they love me, because, like, I got nothing to bring to the table. And so it will be interesting to see, it's like, if Bertha acts in the same way that she's been acting towards Gladys, there's absolutely zero chance that she's going to accept Marian as an option. She definitely does, in the conversation with Mr. Delancey, mention his daughter. So, like, I don't know, that seems intentional. So I can't imagine that she's going to let Larry go without a fight. But TBD, we'll see how #Larian fares in the coming episodes. I want to shift our attention to Peggy, who also has a delightful love match. I would like to point out that Peggy is being courted in the way that she is supposed to be courted. By a lovely gentleman who sends lovely notes to her aunt's house and invites her on lovely walks on the Newport cliffs in a delightful outfit. Like,
I was going to say, I think Peggy's poppy dress is my favorite of the whole show. I was obsessed with it.
It's so good. It's so good. So yeah, we have this really sweet, like, budding, like, romance that is, like, kind of happening in all the right ways, I feel like, and they very clearly have things in common, and, like, they just, like, there's a great chemistry. So, like, that is all going well. We do also get to see more of Newport, which anytime Newport, Rhode Island is on the screen, it's like gorgeous and amazing, and makes me want to go back desperately when it's not cold. But we also get this really interesting peek into the Black community in Newport. And just like anything else really in the Gilded Age, that is very much based in reality and based in sort of a historical story there. And I know, Amanda, you were doing like a little bit of research into what that looked like and sort of how we saw that play out on screen.
Yeah, and actually there was a good quote from Erica Dunbar, who's a historian and co-executive producer of The Gilded Age, and she said, this was in a Time magazine article, "We tried to show through our characters this season that there was a long history of free Black life in New England, and specifically in Rhode Island." And she goes on to talk about how, of course, slavery had been dismantled across New England, in the early 19th century. And so, by the 1840s, so this is 1884, I think, in the episode, for about 2 decades or more, the state had been desegregated. There is still segregation. There are still things happening, but there had been, a couple of generations at this point of free Black men and women living in Newport, building a community, successful. Clearly, the doctor's family is part of, the kind of elite of the area, educated, and that life was very much a part of Newport. And it doesn't get talked about enough for a lot. And I'm glad they've worked to this end. I'm glad they moved Peggy up there because it's letting us get a different look at life for Black Americans. It's not New York, right? The scenario, living up there was more cultural. There were more opportunities. There were more business opportunities. And so they've worked that nicely into this storyline.
Mm-hmm. And I will very rarely plug the official podcast on this show, but I will give them a shout out. If you haven't listened to it and you are really interested in this topic, definitely listen to at least like the second half of the episode, because they do interview Danae Benton and they interview Erica Dunbar, and she talks a lot about this. And one of the things that she mentions is like this idea that, Black Newporters are able to become successful by association to what was making Newport a rich community, right? The tourism, these wealthy tourists coming in and spending time there. And so they were able to position themselves for success by kind of tapping into that, being inn owners and hotel owners, working in shipping, dressmaking, like these industries, and being able to take advantage of those industries. And it reminded me a lot of things that we see here in Pittsburgh as well. There's another example, Cumberland Cap Posey, who was an incredibly successful Black man in Gilded Age Pittsburgh. Like Arthur, he was born into slavery. After emancipation, he comes to Pittsburgh, gets into the riverboat industry, and manages to position himself alongside the coal and steel industries in Pittsburgh. And by the Gilded Age, he's the richest Black man in Pittsburgh, right? So we see time and time again all of these real life examples of people like the Scotts, people like the Kirklands that we get to meet in this episode. And so, yeah, I do think that it's one of the things that the show probably does best. I love kind of watching that unfold. But we have to talk about the interesting, I dare say, dynamic between the Scotts and the Kirklands, because things are going great for Dr. Kirkland and Peggy, but like with any relationship, it doesn't get a true trial until you meet the in-laws. That's part of the game, right? And so we see this really interesting meeting of Peggy's family and the Kirkland family. And at first blush, I think you would think that like these are two pretty evenly matched families, right? Like the Scott family, like Arthur is very successful. He's a businessman. He's got this pharmacy business. Peggy is very well educated. She's a successful writer, right? Dr. Kirkland, it seems like all of their sons or both of their sons are doctors. Like maybe the dad is also a doctor. It's hard to sort of tell. But we very quickly get a peek into kind of the hierarchy within Black society, certainly in Newport, but I think more broadly as well, particularly the ways in which Mrs. Kirkland, who is played by the incredible Felicia Rashad, sort of looks down at Arthur when she finds out that he had been enslaved. And rather than being impressed by the ways in which he was really able to come out of enslavement and make something of himself and become successful, she really like looks down her nose at him. And you can tell that that is something that she is not pleased with, like this idea that Peggy's, she is one generation away essentially from enslavement. And Dalena, you were saying that in some ways, like, there are some parallels between Arthur and even like a Bertha or a George, right? Like these ideas of people who are not born into that kind of society, they make something of themselves, and the ways in which certain people sort of look down at them for that.
Yeah. And you could clearly see that Mrs. Kirkland was fishing for that answer. She was asking with purpose. She was wanting to see what the answer to that question was, to really like clock Arthur's history. But especially Arthur's reaction afterwards. And he is so staunchly offended, not that he shouldn't be, but he's very quickly writes off the entire family and says, well, Peggy won't want to see them anymore. We will not interact with them again. He just reminded me so much of Bertha, who also clearly has such a strong stance. And for all of her faults, she really truly speaks up for and advocates for her family in a way that is really intense. And so seeing Arthur kind of react to this conversation that was really probably horrible for him, just reminded me a lot of her, and feeling like maybe they were both personalities, or they both would have been very, very different, probably very successful people if they had been born in the bodies of white men during this time period. But they weren't. And so they're doing what they can with the situation that they have.
Yeah. And we get a sense that this is certainly not something that Arthur is unfamiliar with, like that he has dealt with this time and time again, even within his own relationship. Like there's a conversation between Dorothy and Athena where they basically, like, we are essentially told that, like, when Dorothy first started, courting with Arthur, that, like, her family was not super jazzed about that as a match either. And that was something that they had to overcome. And so I'm sure that Arthur is looking at that and saying, like, I don't want that to be part of the equation for a relationship for Peggy. And, it's like, I think we can see the parallels between Dorothy, or between Arthur and a Bertha or a George, but like, I think we can also very clearly see some parallels between Mrs. Kirkland and Mrs. Astor. Like she is very much like the grande dame kind of person who decides who is in and who is out in Newport Black society. And, she puts a very big premium on pedigree and ancestry. Like she's very quick to tell us that, she had a great-great-grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War, but he was a free man. He was never enslaved. Like she's very specific about that. And she's very hung up on the, institutions of higher learning that her sons have gone to. Like she tells you that one went to Yale, and we know William, Dr. Kirkland, we know went to Howard. And she throws out, these very specific signifiers of her family's status, sort of in comparison to Peggy. She mentions that she has a family member who was the first Black man to graduate from Harvard, which, that is a real person. Dalena, tell us about the real person who was the first Black man who graduated from Harvard.
My ears instantly perked up, because that's like a tidbit of history that we can go over. So in 1869, George Lewis Ruffin, Edwin C.T.J. Howard, and Robert T. Freeman graduate from Harvard Law, Harvard Medical, and Harvard Dental, respectively. And then the first undergrad is actually 1870. So we see these graduations happen in 1869 and 1870. 1870, Richard Greener is the first undergrad to graduate from then Harvard College. He goes on to be the first Black professor at the University of South Carolina, and then becomes the dean of the Howard Law School. So a lot of connections in there. But yeah, as you're saying, this clearly is something important to her. And this whole conversation, I think, really gets into the nuance of race that exists in the Gilded Age, that is not necessarily something we see completely mirrored in our own society today. And it was definitely fascinating to see it play out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that sort of illusion, or not so much an illusion, just like an overt reference to colorism and this idea that having lighter skin is preferential in some way. Like there's that comment that Mrs. Kirkland makes about her grandchildren not being out in the sun without an umbrella, right? Like this idea that, yeah, again, like I think we as human beings love to sort ourselves into hierarchies, right? And like that's happening, in all different communities across time and across history. And of course, that's something that Arthur and Dorothy have very real concerns about in terms of what that means, for their child. And I don't know, I was thinking about you, Amanda, because I know like you're a mom with like almost a fully adult young girl, and like this idea that like you don't just marry the person, like you marry like into that family, right? And like thinking about that, and I feel like that's something right now that Peggy is not putting a lot of weight on. And I think that Dorothy and Arthur are concerned about that she maybe is not opening her eyes to the reality of life with the Kirklands, specifically Mrs. Kirkland.
Probably true, but also give it time. I mean, Peggy went for one walk. Like they've known each other for all of a hot minute. It's so. I know that was common at the time. The Fricks courted for just a handful of months, but I think Peggy even says that to her mother. Like I'll decide after more than just one outing. Kind of. She may come to that. She may not. But I also loved how her mother reminded her father. Remember what happened the last time you/we got involved in Peggy's life in this way, and it ended terribly. She lost her husband, she lost her child. Like Peggy is not as young or inexperienced as maybe seeing her in her white dress in this environment. She's worked, she's a writer, so she will get there, I think, but also she's allowed to have a little bit of fun. Let Peggy go for some walks. It doesn't have to go right to marriage.
Go for some walks with a hot doctor, girl. Like you have earned
Wear
it.
your pretty dresses and
let her, just take it in the air. Like let her have a minute before
she's convalescing by the sea.
Yes.
And her mother was mad at her mother's cousin for pushing marriage right away, and then they turn and but her father feels things deeply. He is clearly a brilliant, accomplished man who has fought hard for his recognition, and he's very sensitive to that. And with Agnes, we saw with now in this scene, and I admire him for that, and I see where that's coming from. But it'll be interesting to see if Peggy fights her parents again. I was talking 2 episodes ago, or last one, about her, happy trajectory, but it seems like we might have another roadblock block set up for Peggy.
I would also say if anybody can sort of hold their own against a Mrs. Kirkland, I think that it is Peggy Scott. So I will see how that goes. I also would like to see Dorothy and Mrs. Kirkland sort of go toe to toe, because I think that Dorothy can hold her own too. So an interesting thing to be sure. Another really quick topic that we absolutely want to talk about, because we haven't had a chance to dive into it too much yet, is Larry and Jack and their project with the clock. We finally get to see them have some investor meetings. We get to see Jack in his sweet little suit and coming out. He's so proud and going to these investor meetings. And I think it goes back to what you were talking about, Dalena, with this idea of like perception and sort of what are we putting out there to other people. And like this idea, I think when Jack comes out and he's got his suit on, I think it's probably Armstrong or something, that basically is just like, you're just play acting, kind of like, you put on a suit, like that doesn't mean that, you're a businessman now. And it's like, maybe, but I think we see the ways in which that gets turned on its head when we see that sort of final investment where, Larry's got all the bravado, he's got all of the confidence, he's, you can see the way he's sort of pitching, their project and everything, until he gets asked one very specific question about how this damn clock works. And he freezes, and suddenly that perception of him having it all together totally goes away. And that's when Jack has his moment to kind of step in and be like, this is how the clock works, like explaining it. And I'm so glad that he had that opportunity to sort of prove himself, but also to get a little bit of that confidence boost, because he really is sort of a really great example of like the idea of an American dream, or an idea of anybody being able to make something of themselves. We do get a really interesting conversation that I wanted to mention right at the more towards the beginning, which is the conversation about the American dream in the parlor. of the Van Rhijn house. I think it's interesting. First of all, we get that great quote from Jack where he's like, I would love the opportunity to find out if being rich and successful makes you happy. But it's an interesting thing because I was thinking about it. They mentioned specifically the American dream, and that is a little bit of an anachronism. It's a little bit out of sort of historical order for things. Certainly the concept of the American dream has tenets that go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. It's very much what sort of the country is built on. But the phrase the American dream is not popularized until the 1930s. It is popularized by an author named James Truslow Adams. And very interestingly, he sort of critiques wealth inequity as kind of the enemy of the American dream in his book, which I think is a really interesting thing to point out within the context of a show about the Gilded Age, where we're seeing, obviously a lot of wealth inequity, and that's very much what that sort of era is all about. So it was interesting to me that they sort of throw that line out there, even though, the term the American dream is not really something that we would have been seeing in kind of popular conversations in the 1880s. I do want to talk really quickly too, before we get to some fan questions at the end, just about what is going on in the Van Rhijn household.
I don't know, but I'm here for it. Every conversation that plays out, I'm just laughing and laughing. Agnes's acerbic wit, and poor Oscar, who just like takes every hit his mother throws, and it's topsy turvy was the phrase that came to mind, like literally and figuratively, like how the household economics have changed and impacting all of their. It's like nobody's sure what to do anymore over there, and I feel like it's made it very fun. I'm enjoying it, but they're all struggling in different ways too.
Yeah. Agnes is just, I think, realizing the ways in which her position was so tied to her money in maybe a way that she didn't fully comprehend or maybe fully appreciate when she had it. And like this idea that money is power no matter who you are. And now she doesn't hold the purse strings. And so she's getting left out of charities and she's not getting invited to things, right? Because charities want your money at the end of the day. Like, that's why you have those parties. And like, if the perception is that she can't contribute anything, like she's not going to get invited, Ada's going to get invited instead. So it is an interesting continuation of that role reversal and the ways in which, they are struggling with that. But I also think we get Ada, who just like really can't let go of the temperance, like really can't let go, but is like kind of really sad and pathetic about it in this episode, where she just kind of keeps being like, has anyone signed my pledge? And like, nobody has, except
there are such foils to eeach other. Like Agnes is so bold and so, especially now that she really has nothing to lose, like you can tell she's acting like it. And Ada is just kind of like shrinking into herself a little bit, even when this is kind of her moment to step out. And you see her try a couple of times, but I want her to realize that the dynamic doesn't need to be the same. She doesn't need to hold the same sort of control that Agnes did. And then in fact, maybe it's a better thing that your staff feels like they can be honest with you, that they feel like they can have conversations with you, whereas they didn't feel like they could have that with your sister. But yeah, she gets a little like, I feel for her, but I also think she's like a little annoying.
A little bit. She's had no training, though, at being the lead woman or the lead person, right? She's had at no point in her life. In fact, Agnes says that. Well, because she said, well, I was your guest all these years. And she said, but you were a spinster. There was no other expectation. She was never raised or had an experience to be in charge. And there's nobody helping her. She's finding her way herself. So it's at times pitiful. It's at times maddening. It's at times sort of sad and heartbreaking. And so she's turning to some crazy options, perhaps, to try to fill a void for herself here at the end.
Well, and what I appreciated about the end of the episode is that I think we got a little bit better of an understanding of like really where she is sort of like emotionally and mentally. Like Dalena, you mentioned, like I've noticed it also, like she is still wearing mourning black, which is, customary. Most women would stay wearing black, and stay in mourning for up to 2 years after a husband's death. So it makes total sense that she would still be kind of in full mourning in that way. But I thought it was really interesting that at the end we get like a little bit of a glimpse into what her grief looks like, because we haven't, I mean, she makes references to Luke and she talks about wanting to do things in his memory, but we haven't really seen her sort of privately grieve for him. And what I was thinking at the end, especially as she has that really kind of heartbreaking conversation with Mrs. Bauer, that like, it's not really about temperance. Like, it's about her having a place to put her grief and like having a place to put her energy and her thoughts. And so she sort of convinced herself that like if she can get this going with the temperance movement, that like she's honoring her husband's memory and that somehow maybe that's going to make her feel better or miss him a little bit less, which I think, you know, anybody who's lost anyone will tell you like doesn't help. Maybe it does a little bit, but like it's all just coping, right? You're just trying to get through that. But we get this really interesting tease at the end where Mrs. Bauer is sort of like, if you could talk to him again, would you? And Ada's like, yeah, but like, what are you talking about? like she's like, what are you talking about? I think that is absolutely some foreshadowing that we are going to see Ada dip her toes into the spiritualism movement. So I think I think I texted Amanda last night. I just said, I was like, forget temperance, like full steam ahead spiritualism. Yes, like let's do it. It's gonna
picturing them at that kitchen table, the lights are dimmed, doing the thing, and then Agnes is gonna catch them, and it's gonna be amazing. That's my prediction. We'll see.
Yeah, it's like Agnes, like you thought temperance was insane.
Or Armstrong will rat them out. Something will happen.
Armstrong, no, yeah. So, which again, we'll get into it. I'm sure. I think that's where it's going. But like, spiritualism was very much a real movement in the 19th century, and by the 1880s, like full steam ahead, has a lot of followers. So I did not see that coming, but I am very excited to see where that goes. So to wrap up our conversation, we did have just a few quick comments and questions from last episode that I wanted to chat about really quickly. The first is from a viewer with username Kenneth Crone, who makes a very good observation that in the last episode, when the Duke arrives, he arrives with his lawyer, and everyone is sort of surprised. And so sort of asking the question of like, was the table set properly? Did they have a place for this person to stay? Like, what's going on there? And I think that the assumption that we are to make is that the lawyer's arrival is a surprise to everyone except Bertha. And I think that the thing to remember is that Bertha's running the show in the household, right? Like, if she knows who's coming, it would be nothing for her to direct to the maids, like, hey, get the bedroom set up. You know, Church would probably be setting an extra seat at the table. Church maybe knows that, like, this lawyer is coming, which is an interesting thing. But certainly George doesn't. Like, George isn't going into the dining room and being like, oh, like, who's this fifth person for dinner? Like, he's not paying attention to those things because, as Dalena pointed out, he's not paying attention to the things that his wife is worrying about. So I think that that's what we're supposed to assume. My other favorite part of this question is, what do we think Marian was talking to the Russells about while Larry and Gladys were off running around at the servants' entrance?
Yeah, I would not trade places with her in that situation for like a lot of money. I'm good.
Awkward chit chat.
It's just like, so like cold spring we've been having, like, you know, it's just like,
yeah.
How are your hands?
Yeah, like, how's it going with you? Like, just like anything, like when you're at your friend's house and they leave the room for a minute and you're suddenly like, I don't know. Talk to my friend's parents. Like, it's just very weird, though. I thought that was very funny. So our second question is a question that we have sort of asked ourselves a little bit, but I think it's worth unpacking a little bit. One of our viewers, Barbara Seville, asks, what do we know about the Russells' backgrounds, specifically about Bertha? And I think almost nothing. Is the answer. We've gotten a few like little teeny tiny references. I think in season 1, there is a reference to her family being potato farmers, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think we're supposed to assume that perhaps we're looking at Irish immigrants that had, you know, immigrated to the US previously. Am I wrong? I don't think we know anything about George. Like, nothing.
I think Amanda and I were talking about this earlier, and she pointed out that we really don't talk about the Russells' family either. Mm-hmm. There's no family coming to visit. There's no family like parties or leaving
grandparents.
Family, grandparents. So yeah, it's all a bit of a question mark. I think they're trying to allude to the fact that they clearly don't come from high society. They're not from old money. So I don't know if they're trying to allude to the fact that they have the sort of beginning that we see like an Andrew Carnegie, but maybe a little like higher placed in the hierarchy of society, maybe not. It'd be great to see more about that kind of history.
Well, I'm delighted to say that I watched the preview for next week, and there is a reference to Bertha's sister attending this wedding. So I think that we're maybe going to get a little bit more insight than we have had about Bertha's family, certainly, and maybe where she comes from, which I think is incredible, because I think we deserve to know. we need
answers.
Much insight will be gleaned by a family interaction, I think.
Yes.
That'll be fun to see.
Yes. So, we know, like I said, from just little snippets of conversations that she and George have had, we know, she makes that comment to Gladys that, she was nobody when she married George. And so the stakes were lower. So it will be very interesting to see us broaden the family tree a little bit and see what that might look like. So again, all things to look forward to. So this is, of course, a quick reminder that you can drop whatever questions you have or want us to talk about in the comment sections of our videos. We do look at those. And of course, we can't talk about everything. So if there is something that you are just dying to know or want our opinions on, please feel free to drop those in the comments. But until then, thanks, of course, for watching and spending some time with us. We will be back next Friday for a brand new episode of the Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. Until then, thanks for watching.